Hello and welcome to News Hour from the BBC World Service, coming to you live from London. I'm Julian Marshall. Later in the programme, the challenges at the heart of conservation. What happens when wildlife and humans share the same land?
Camels, donkeys, sheep, cows are often killed by lions. And understandably, when this happens, there's so much anger and resentment from the local communities because this is their life. And often lions are then shot, speared or poisoned in retaliation.
That report in full later in this edition of News Hour. President Trump is back in the US after the briefest of visits to Iraq, his first to US troops in a combat zone since he was elected. The troops were pleased to see him, although one Iraqi MP has called for an emergency session of Parliament to discuss what he said was this flagrant violation of Iraq's sovereignty. Mr. Trump is also facing criticism at home for his decision to pull US troops out of Syria and slash troop numbers in Afghanistan. The US Defense Secretary Jim Mattis resigned over the decision. But Mr. Trump told US service personnel at Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq that the US was not abandoning the region, but he said the United States will no longer be the world's policeman.
America shouldn't be doing the fighting for every nation on earth, not being reimbursed in many cases at all. If they want us to do the fighting, they also have to pay a price. And sometimes that's also a monetary price. So we're not the suckers of the world. We're no longer the suckers, folks, and people aren't looking at us as suckers.
And a short while ago, I spoke to Iraqi MP Inas al-Maghsousi. She's with the coalition led by the Shia cleric Muqtada al-Sadr. How did she feel about Mr. Trump's visit?
Trump's visit to American troops in Iraq on Wednesday was unacceptable, and it is criticized by all the Iraqis and by all the politicians because we didn't know even anything about his visit, for what and to whom, and what are the reasons behind this visiting.
Mr. Trump told those American troops that even though America is pulling its troops out of Syria, even though America is reducing its troop levels in Afghanistan, America is still committed to keeping American troops in Iraq. Does that please you?
We Iraqi, and we look for Iraq as independent country. We do not need any help from any country.
So, would you like American troops to pull out of Iraq?
I like Iraq to be Iraq, just it was in the past. Yes, without American troops. I like Iraq to be Iraq, without any troops.
If the American troops do pull out, it is possible, is it not, that Iran will increase its influence?
This is my answer for all the countries who is going to be within my country. I'm going to say no. I'm going to give them a red card. You are our friends, but you are not our kings.
That was Iraqi MP Inas al-Maghsousi, and Raja Labi is the Reuters news agency correspondent in Baghdad. How representative were those views of Iraqi public opinion?
Well, I think shortly after Trump's visit was made public last night, the major political leaders and certain militia commanders put out statements strongly condemning the visit. So she certainly wasn't alone in expressing condemnation of the visit. A lot of these sort of political leaders and the two main parliamentary blocs came out and called the visit a violation of Iraqi sovereignty, which is the language that is all permeated throughout the political sphere. In terms of how that represents the public opinion, I think on the whole, we spoke to a few people on the streets of Iraq last night, and on the whole, most people didn't seem to feel very strongly about President Trump's visit. We spoke to a young resident of Baghdad last night who said it doesn't really matter whether Trump visits a US military base or if he visits the government. We're never going to get anything from America. They've been in the country 16 years and we've never sort of benefited from them. All they've brought is devastation and destruction to our country. So it's a sort of mixed bag.
But do the Iraqis see the US military presence as a protection against a resurgent Islamic State?
The problems are endemic when it comes to Islamic State's resurgence in Iraq. Although the security situation has vastly improved in the last year or so, there's been a dramatic drop in militant attacks in the capital, for instance. There is still a looming threat and a possible resurgence of the militant group, and that's because the root causes haven't fully been addressed by the Iraqi state. And so the US military presence, whose role is to generally advise the Iraqi security forces in their battle against ISIS and their sort of continuing battle against ISIS, I think they're sort of seen as helping the Iraqi security forces rather than providing much else. I don't think they're looked at as the force that's going to protect Iraq from any sort of future incursions or any sort of future resurgence of the group.
But I mean, how secure is Iraq at the moment?
There's been a dramatic improvement in security in the last year. It's been about a year since Iraq declared victory over Islamic State. And this is a militant group that occupied up to 2/3 of the country at a certain point. So territorially, the group has lost control of vast areas of the country. There are still certain pockets, and there's concern over sleeper cells, notably in the eastern parts of the north of the country. But for the most part, security has improved. I mean, there is still concern. There has been a sort of spate of attacks every now and again, but major attacks haven't occurred in the capital in recent memory. I mean, it's been about 2 years since the last major bombing in Baghdad.
Raj Alabi, the correspondent in Baghdad for the Reuters news agency. And let's speak now to our White House correspondent, Tara McKelvey in Washington. Tara, how has news of Mr. Trump's visit to Iraq been received back in the United States?
Well, I saw Mr. Trump arrive this morning. He arrived in his helicopter and walked across the South Lawn. He had a thick overcoat. It was still pre-dawn, and he looked completely exhausted. The trip was a long trip, and people in Washington are happy that he made it. A lot of people here in Washington think that the trip was long overdue, that he's the commander-in-chief, and it was about time that he visited the combat troops in a combat zone. But now here in D.C., people are wondering what's going to happen next. There's this standoff between members of Congress and the president over a spending bill, and as a result, there's this partial government shutdown, and more than 400,000 government employees are working without getting paid. So everyone's wondering, when's this shutdown going to end, and what's the president going to do now?
What will it do, though, for Mr. Trump's poll numbers?
In terms of his popularity, Mr. Trump has a very broad base of support within the military. About 47% of enlisted men think he's doing a really good job. A lot of the reason that they like him is not so much because of his policies, but more for who he is. They like his ideas. They like the way he talks. They like the fact that he's trying to make sure that America is no longer pushed around on the world stage, and America is asserting its position and is taking care of Americans.
So the kind of language that he used to U.S. troops in Iraq, we're not suckers, will appeal to the U.S. military back in the United States. But what about his explanations for the troop withdrawals from Syria and drawdown in Afghanistan?
Right. These kinds of military policies that President Trump seems to make on the fly are really disturbing for the leaders of the military, both the civilian leaders and also commanders. They're trying to sort out what the president's going to do next. A lot of times these announcements come as a surprise, but in terms of his base, they're very loyal to him, and they're not so concerned about the details. They like the way that he's standing tall, and they're going to stick by him, most likely.
Tara, many thanks. Tara McKelvey, our White House correspondent. 2018 draws to a close with the prospect of an end to more than 3 years of war in Yemen, at least in the crucial port city of Hodeidah. The head of the UN Peace Monitors has held his first meeting there with the warring parties to discuss the ceasefire, which came into effect last week. And the hope is that the ceasefire might be rolled out to the rest of the country. The war has created the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet. And yet life goes on. This week we have 5 reports from 5 women living in different towns and cities across the country. Today we hear from Arina Umar, who lives in Mukalla, the capital of Hadramaut province in the east of the country.
The life in Hadramaut now in Mukalla is so quiet. It's nice. It's on the Arabian Sea. Hadramaut is so beautiful. I live with my family. I have one sister, she's older than me, and she's a lawyer. I like spending time with my friends when we go to the parks. Sometimes we are getting crazy and going to the beach. But it wasn't always like that. In 2014, Mukalla fell under the control of Al Qaeda. The situation and the life in general in Mukalla became so bad, especially for us as women. They were controlling our lives in work, the schools, university. It was impossible for us to go outside. Even if you are two girls or something, it's still insecure for us. It's still unsafe. This ideology is so new for us. So we felt like we are in Taliban, like in Afghanistan or something. We felt like our future would be like this. All of us as women were under a lot of psychological pressure, and a lot of women are still suffering mental health problems until now. The idea of establishing a foundation concentrating on peace journalism and investigative journalism, it was my dream or my passion. I put the idea with 3 of my friends, 2 boys and 1 girl. We established that foundation and we are working on it now. We need awareness to make the people know more about the good sides in Yemen. Yemen is not just a country of war, no. I don't believe that the peace talks will help Yemen getting out of this problem, because the war in Yemen is like a business for some people. For their own interest, they want this war to last forever. For 2019, I wish the impossible peace for Yemen. I wish for my family and also for me and my friends and for all the Yemeni people to live in peace.
Arina Umar from Mukalla in the east of Yemen. You're listening to the BBC World Service. This is News Hour. Coming up, our BBC correspondent Julia Carneiro reflects on a year in Brazilian politics where the election of President Jair Bolsonaro has split the country and even families.
I saw couples, cousins, school friends fight bitterly and sometimes stop talking to each other. The WhatsApp messaging app became a battleground.
Also this hour, the United Arab Emirates has reopened its embassy in Syria as Arab countries move to rehabilitate President Assad, and the security forces in the Democratic Republic of Congo have clashed with protesters angry at a further delay in the presidential election in some areas. You're listening to the BBC World Service. This is News Hour. The former deputy head of China's spy agency has been sentenced to life in prison for taking bribes, insider trading and threatening behaviour. The court said Ma Jian and his family had amassed more than $20 million. With me in the studio, the BBC's Asia Pacific editor, Michael Bristow. And what was the case against Mr. Ma?
Well, it was quite a compelling case, and we know quite a few details actually about it. Unusually, the Chinese authorities have released quite a lot about what went on in court, even though the trial was behind closed doors. Essentially, the accusation was that he was in cahoots with a businessman called Guo Wengui, who's since fled to the United States and is living in exile there. And what would happen is Mr. Guo would come up with all kinds of plans and schemes, and Mr. Ma Jian, the man who's been sentenced to life in prison today, would help enforce those plans. So, for example, Mr. Guo would want a business partner out of the way. Then his friend in the security services would arrest him. Ma Jian specifically was accused, you mentioned there, threatening behaviour of sending operatives around to businessmen, forcing them to hand over shares, forcing them to forego business opportunities or withdraw from an area of business where they might have wanted to operate. So quite a lot of detail.
Totally separate from that case, Michael, state media are reporting that top Chinese leaders have been forced to undergo a self-criticism session. What's that all about?
It's quite an unusual statement that Xinhua have put out. Xinhua is a state-run news agency in China, so if they're putting something out, we can be pretty certain this is what's gone on. It reflects a Politburo meeting which has happened over the last couple of days. The Politburo is a 25-person body at the top of the Chinese Communist Party which rules China with an iron fist, and usually we hear very little about the inner workings of what goes on there at those meetings apart from the occasional anodyne statement. But here it seems to suggest that there's real disagreement at the top of the party. We get Politburo members being forced to undergo criticism and self-criticism sessions, and listeners who aren't familiar with that's something from the Mao Zedong area where Mao would be disagree with one leader or another and force them to explain what it is that they'd done wrong, sometimes in quite humiliating circumstances. So if this is happening at the very top of the party, it does suggest that at the very least there are people who don't agree entirely with the way Xi Jinping is running the country.
On what particular issue, Michael, briefly?
Well, there are a couple of issues. One of them at the moment, the biggest one, is the trade war that China has with the United States. But there are a whole raft of issues about the direction of the country and the party, state industries versus private industry, a whole raft of issues they could be arguing about.
Michael, many thanks. That was our Asia Pacific editor, Michael Bristow. Rescue efforts are going on around the clock to try to save 15 workers trapped inside an illegal coal mine in a remote northeastern part of India. Limited resources and lack of information of mines in the area are making the operation extremely challenging. Hopes of finding anyone alive after 2 weeks are fading fast. Davina Gupta travelled to the rescue site in the state of Meghalaya.
We have travelled from India's capital, Delhi, for a total of 12 hours to come to the remote northeastern part of the country. We head to see rescue operations at a hillside where 15 coal miners are believed trapped inside an illegal coal mine.
It's a scene of utter confusion. Rescue workers dressed in orange suits are standing on top of piles of coal. They're trying to reach over to a dozen miners trapped in a 300 feet deep underground coal mine. What's making it more difficult is that the water that flooded the mine is still at the same level. They're trying to pump out this water, and so far only several broken helmets have been removed.
The coal miners, all in their early 20s, are believed to be trapped in what is called a rat hole mine. It's a narrow pit dug on the side of a hill, which leads to small horizontal tunnels inside. The space is so small that workers have to lie on their back to pass through to reach a coal seam. These rat hole mines are illegal and have been banned since 2014 after high pollution levels started contaminating the rivers here. But the practice of extracting coal from them is still widespread. A crane is now being used to carry expert divers inside the flooded mine. The rescue team in charge, Santosh Kumar Singh, tells me there are at least 100 such underground pits in the area, and they could be interconnected.
This is one of the very complex and complicated type of rescue operations, since we do not have even the maps and the blueprints of the mining, and we even do not know the directions in which the laborers being trapped. Another big challenge that we are facing, the over-flooded mine. We are unable to pull out all the water.
A few kilometers away on a mountain top is the village of Lumthari. In a small white church, a group is praying for the trapped miners. One of the miners, 20-year-old Shabad Dhar, wanted to earn money at a coal mine to contribute at the church service on Christmas here. His mother is inconsolable. She covers her face with her hands when I ask about her son. Her last memory is of trying to stop him from working in a coal mine.
I stopped him, but he won't listen. I don't know what to feel anymore. My husband told me after 7 days. I couldn't even go to search for my son.
In a coal market nearby, it's a busy day. Small piles of raw coal rocks are spread out on a muddy ground. The coal shines in the sun. Workers are busy shoveling it in a wooden basket and then unloading it on a truck. Mining is a lucrative business here. Though this illegal practice is banned, traders are allowed to transport the coal that was already excavated. Activist Roseanne tells me that this is a loophole that is exploited by the traders to escape the law.
The people working there, they don't have facilities. They don't have safety gears. They don't know whether they are going to live or die. When they crawl in, sometimes the roof collapses. There's no, such health facilities for them, no sanitation for them, no proper housing for them, nothing like that. When they go in, they don't know when they're coming back.
Back at the flooded mine, the rescue operations are ending for the day. I spot the head of the district, FM Doff, sitting under a makeshift tent.
To ban mining because the livelihood of people here, but at the same time, mining should be done. It should be regulated so that people also have got a livelihood. But I say it should be in a scientific way and regulated way so that environment is not affected, people's lives also are not affected.
He tells me the state government is now fighting in the court to legalize coal mining so that workers can be given more rights and minimum wages. But for now, hope is fast getting buried in the flooded coal pit. This place is a grim reminder of the lives that are risked every day in the belly of these hills for the greed of a few.
Davina Gupta reporting from northeast India. Do stay with us here on NewsHour. A lot more to come in the next 30 minutes. Welcome back to NewsHour. And 2018 started with a big question in Brazil. Who would be the next president? Jair Bolsonaro was far from the favourite in the first half of the year, but he'll be sworn in as president on January the 1st. The presidential campaign had many twists and turns. One of Mr. Bolsonaro's main opponents was arrested in April, and the incoming president was stabbed while campaigning in September. The BBC's Julia Cañero reflects on what it has been like to cover the elections and other major stories in Latin America's biggest country.
The elections pitted the left against the right, and friends and families took sides. I saw couples, cousins, school friends fight bitterly and sometimes stop talking to each other. The WhatsApp messaging app became a battleground for fake news. Bolsonaro ended up being elected with big support from groups like farmers, evangelical churches, and lorry drivers who held a massive strike in May. They blocked crucial roads and highways. I spoke to some of the strikers outside Rio's main refinery belonging to oil giant Petrobras. Day and night, the drivers were blocking the gate and preventing fuel trucks from filling up, cutting off supply to gas stations across the city. This generated chaos, with empty shelves in supermarkets and airports canceling flights. But people drove by honking their horns to show their support, and some even left food for the lorry drivers. They received solidarity because of Brazil's economic crisis, which is deepening inequality and raising poverty levels. This is very visible in my home city, Rio. There are more people begging and a lot more people, sometimes entire families, living on the streets. Over a quarter of Brazil's population live in poverty, and the number is on the rise. Violent crime is escalating too, and this is very palpable, especially for residents of favelas and areas dominated by criminal gangs. Violence and politics crossed paths in March when Marielle Franco was murdered in Rio, shot dead inside her car. She was a young city councillor, a black woman who had grown up in a favela in Rio and stood up for the rights of the least privileged.
You're watching GMT on BBC World News. Our top stories. A huge fire engulfs one of the biggest and most important art collections in Latin America. Firefighters are still
when
struggling
the National
to
Museum,
bring the
Brazil's
flames under
oldest
control.
culture and
Brazil's
science
National
institution,
Museum
was destroyed by fire, it felt symbolic. It had 20 million artifacts and precious collections of natural history and anthropology. Most of it went up in flames. Firefighters were criticized for their slow response, and water hydrants failed to work. At the scene, people around me were asking, if Brazil can't even take care of its past, how is it going to build a better future?
That was the BBC's Julia Carneiro with that look back at Brazil in 2018. You're listening to News Hour from the BBC. I'm Julian Marshall. Demonstrators have clashed with security forces in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo a day after the Election Commission announced that some parts of the east will not get to vote on Sunday because of insecurity and an Ebola outbreak. Shots were heard in the town of Beni, where hundreds of people took to the streets, burning tyres and blocking roads. Organising elections in a country the size of Western Europe is a significant challenge. In rural areas of the country where more than 60% of the population live, many doubt a new president would change their worsening living conditions. The BBC's Louise Duast reports from Equateur province.
The Electoral Commission is racing to equip more than 75,000 polling stations across this vast country. They are already a week late. Here in the city of Bandaka, in the equatorial rainforest, the challenges are immense.
Big boxes are now being unloaded from an army truck and carried onto a small, slightly run-down boat. In front of us, the Congo River, along which dozens of fishing villages built on stilts are still waiting to receive these boxes. Inside, election results tallying sheets, but also solar panels, motorbikes, sat phones. It'll take them about a day to reach their destination of Basankusu.
Achille Bolekela is responsible for overseeing the whole operation in the area.
80% here will be transported along the Congo River by water, and that's not easy. We believe we can deliver all this in 1 week. We have just 1 week for all of the material to arrive at the last polling station. It must arrive before Friday.
The small village of Jombo is only 15 kilometers away, but getting there is a mission. The waterlogged dirt road crisscrosses the rainforest. Every single day, traders, students and others struggle to navigate the terrain. Some go by foot, others by bicycle. Joseph Alongea is a pineapple farmer. He and his wife Esther have 7 children. Only 3 can afford to go to school.
He's showing us one of his pineapple trees. This is a beautiful field, 3 hectares approximately of pineapples. Everything here was planted by Joseph himself. He works with a machete. That's pretty much it. He also owns a few goats, ducks. And there's about 3-4 ponds in the middle of the pineapple plantations.
Ici, la vie est difficile.
Life is difficult here. There are no hospitals, poor roads, no medicine, and no one has any money.
Et pas d'argent aussi.
He feels abandoned by his government, but he still wants to vote, he says.
C'est notre droit de voter.
It's our right to vote. If we don't vote, the country won't function well, and we will suffer further.
On the day that was meant to be voting day, we visited the village polling station. There was no electoral material in sight, no booth, no ballot boxes, no voter registry on the door.
Je suis enseignant ici dans cette école. Et la CENI m'a pris comme...
Jean-Pierre Ikembo is a teacher and the director of the voting centre.
We hear on the grapevine that the election material will arrive in the polling centres, but nothing has arrived yet.
Ikembo and many of the villagers are worried the material might never arrive. Some also think the vote could be rigged. An older woman, Mandundu Ekumu, stopped by the polling station that day. She was disappointed to hear the election had been delayed until Sunday.
There will be change, but only if those in power leave and we have new leaders. This election is different compared to other elections. In the past, we didn't suffer like we do now.
In Jombo, 400 people are registered to vote, a tiny fraction of the 40 million nationwide. But this village is representative of thousands of others where the population wants to vote, but feel their fate is not in their hands.
The BBC's Louise Dewast reporting from the Democratic Republic of Congo. An American adventurer has become the first person to complete a solo trek across Antarctica without assistance of any kind. Colin Brady finished the 1,600-kilometre crossing in 53 days, ahead of a British Army captain, Lewis Rudd, who was racing against him. They were travelling across the coldest continent on Earth in some of the most extreme conditions. Earlier this year, Major Nicola Wetherell led the first all-female team to cross Antarctica on the same route, using only skis and their own muscle power. What did she make of Colin's feat?
What Colin has achieved is incredible. To have done the distance that he's done in the conditions that he's experiencing is phenomenal. It's been incredibly fast.
And how much more difficult is it to make the kind of trip that he did on his own rather than as you did as part of a group?
When you're obviously on your own, you've got only yourself to think about. I mean, you can go however fast you need to go, whereas part of a team, you're looking at the slowest person or the weakest person. And then you've got the interpersonal relationships, which when there's only 6 people for 60 days, that takes some negotiating, some managing as well. So it's just preparing for it.
But going solo presumably is more of a physical challenge, even though you can go at your own speed?
What Colin has and what Lou will shortly finish is crossing the continent, so from the land coast to land coast, without resupplies or without anyone giving them any food or any kit along the way, and on their own having to pull all the spares in case anything gets ruined. So the weight is a lot more than we certainly had.
But he, like you, are travelling through that same hostile landscape.
Yeah, we did exactly the same route, but in reverse.
I mean, just give us some sense of how overwhelming that journey must sometimes be. Total whiteness, freezing cold. What do you think about?
The scenery doesn't really change. It is mainly white. Occasionally you'll have blue and white when the sun is out. It's actually a very refreshing thought to be in a location where essentially you are the most isolated that anyone can ever be. Sometimes it can be really scary when you know that you're so far from the nearest person, but equally it's an incredible experience.
I mean, I would imagine the high point obviously is crossing the finishing line, but low points. There must have been some points during that journey, as there must have been for Colin O'Brady, where you've just thought, really, I just cannot go on.
There was always low points, and I think the advantage that we had was that among the 6 of us, our low point was always at a different time, so we had other people to bring us up. I know Colin, I've certainly been reading his blogs and following him, and he had very difficult days mentally, which is always more challenging to deal with than the physically difficult days. But there's always highs as well, so you always look for the next advantage point. So whether it be reaching the South Pole or reaching latitude points, whatever it is, you'll always look for some positive to get across the continent.
British Army Major Nicola Wetherell. Sir David Attenborough is the British natural historian who's won universal acclaim for his Blue Planet Wildlife series. In his latest, filmed in Kenya and broadcast recently, his film crew witnessed how lions were poisoned by cattle herders. The herders were simply trying to protect their livelihoods after some of their animals had been killed. The incident illustrated the wider problem of conflict and conservation where humans and wild animals share the same land. Our Africa correspondent Alistair Leithhead reports.
Whizzing. The legs are collapsed.
This was one of the lions, shown on David Attenborough's recent Dynasties nature documentary, poisoned by cattle herders in the Masai Mara.
Today has been a very tough day for me. I was called to come and check on a lion that I treated some 3 days ago for suspected poisoning.
Vet Campaign Limo did what he could.
Doing a thorough examination, it was evident that this lion was on his way to death. So we had to take the very painful decision to euthanize this lion.
Dr. Shivani Bala is with Ewasu Lions.
Camels, donkeys, sheep, cows are often killed by lions. And understandably, when this happens, there's so much anger and resentment from the local communities because this is their life. And often lions are then shot, speared, or poisoned in retaliation.
Africa's population will double in the next 30 years. And that's only going to pile more pressure onto the conflict between humans and wildlife, whether it be lions or elephants. Maasai communities come in and out of the parks all the time with their cattle.
I'm standing just outside Amboseli National Park. It's a few kilometres to the gate down the road there. But there are no fences, so the animals can wander through the communities that join on to the park. And of course, they have, in this case, cattle. And a 10-year-old boy was tending to the cattle when he was attacked by a large bull elephant, and he was killed. Another boy with him ran back to the houses just a few hundred metres away and raised the alarm. I met Ms. Timo, whose grandson Tepape died. He explained that his grandson and another boy were checking the fields close to the village when they were attacked by an elephant. Tepape was trampled to death. And then the community went out in pursuit of the elephants and killed 2 of them.
My name is Ian Douglas Hamilton, and I'm up in the Samburu National Reserve in the north of Kenya. I run Save the Elephants, and that's just what we try to do. We're looking after a large population of African elephants up in the north of Kenya. Of course, it's worrying that we currently have 1 billion people in Africa, and there will be 4 billion by the beginning of the next century. But our feeling is that by doing careful research work and getting to know local people, we can both know what the animal problems are and then how their needs can be reconciled with local people.
We went to a Maasai cultural village to see just how much of a competition for land there is. Chief Nangyu admitted cattle were sometimes illegally taken into the reserve.
We don't have enough grass here around. That's the reason why we take our cattle at night to go where the wild animal is.
And how many animals are killed by lions? How much of a problem is it for you?
From each and every night, from 5 to 10 cows killing by the wild animal, but we know that we are not allowed to kill of any wild animal at all.
Maasai Chief Nangyu ending that report from Alistair Leithhead in Kenya. reminder of our top story this hour. After nearly 2 years as president, Donald Trump has made his first trip to a war zone with a surprise visit to US troops in Iraq. Reuters correspondent Raya Jalabi told this programme the visit was unwelcome.
Well, I think shortly after Trump's visit was made public last night, a lot of these sort of political leaders and the two main parliamentary blocs came out and called the visit a violation of Iraqi sovereignty, which is the language that is all permeated throughout the political sphere.
And the latest headlines from the BBC Newsroom. The United Arab Emirates has reopened its embassy in Syria as Arab countries move to rehabilitate President Assad. And the security forces in the Democratic Republic of Congo clash with protesters angry at a further delay in the presidential election in some areas. This is Julian Marshall with NewsHour live from the BBC in London. A new film just out in the United States starring Felicity Jones portrays the early career of 85-year-old Supreme Court Associate Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The Liberal Justice was discharged from hospital yesterday after doctors successfully removed cancerous nodules from her lungs. She's become a pop culture icon with an especially strong following among young people. Her face is emblazoned on T-shirts, mugs and bags. Tom Brooke reports on the unlikely celebrity appeal of this octogenarian Supreme Court justice.
You're making the wrong case. These are laws written by men who think we are privileged to be excused from men's obligations, but it is not a privilege, it is a cage, and these laws are the bars.
British actress Felicity Jones plays a feisty Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the film On the Basis of Sex, which is a fictionalised account of the justice's early career. Felicity Jones believes Ruth Bader Ginsburg has such celebrity appeal because of her stature.
She is someone in a position of power who has huge integrity and has got to where she's got to because of that integrity, and we don't have many people like her to look up to.
But Ginsburg's appeal is exceptional. Millennials have really responded to her. There's a whole generation of young feminists who admire her stinging dissents in a Supreme Court that leans to the right. Known by her initials RBG, her popularity has given rise to a moniker. The diminutive justice is referred to as Notorious RBG, a play on the name of the late rapper Notorious B.I.G. There's even a Notorious RBG official music video.
Case by case, they paved the way for the next generation. Bring females into the equation.
Filmmaker Julie Cohen, who co-directed the biographical RBG documentary, sees Ruth Bader Ginsburg as a unique cultural figure.
There aren't that many Supreme Court justices. I don't know if there's ever been one who has their face on tote bags, mugs, pens, pins, hats, T-shirts. It's a somewhat unusual phenomenon. It's not usual for someone who's famous for their work in the law to become a celebrity. It's not usual for a woman in her 80s to suddenly kind of skyrocket into stardom, but that's what's happened with Justice Ginsburg.
The point is that the discriminatory line almost inevitably hurts women.
In her younger years, Ruth Bader Ginsburg argued successfully against cases based on gender discrimination before the Supreme Court. This and her tremendous work ethic brought respect. Her nephew, Daniel Stiepelman, who wrote the screenplay for On the Basis of Sex, thinks her celebrity appeal has to do with her basic honesty.
I think the reason people are so drawn to her is that she's authentic. When she doesn't want your vote, she's not a politician. She's not trying to sell you anything. She never was trying to get on the Supreme Court. She couldn't even get a job after she graduated from law school. And so I think when she speaks, she's speaking from her heart and she's speaking from what she really believes. There's not that many people in power you can say that about anymore.
But Ruth Bader Ginsburg is a polarising figure. A large part of her appeal is that she is seen as a foil to the fired-up voices on the right. Mimi Leder directed On the Basis of Sex.
I think that there's a poisonous atmosphere out there in the world, and that we have to continuously, as Justice Ginsburg does, persuade with an argument that doesn't destroy people, but that connects people. And I think she's rocky. What can I say?
Some conservatives think much of the adoration of Ruth Bader Ginsburg is misplaced. Kyle Smith, critic at large at National Review, believes the 2 films on her show that Ruth Bader Ginsburg isn't the person her activist supporters make her out to be.
She believed very much in incremental change. She believed in working within the system to improve the system rather than sort of backing this sort of revolutionary rhetoric. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is a very small, slight woman. She's kind of mumbly. She's kind of a law elf. She's elfin. It was seen as very kind of funny to portray her as this kind of mighty force for change and to put a crown on her and to compare her to a famous rapper.
Maybe Ruth Bader Ginsburg was mystified by the pop culture adoration at first, but she's really embraced it. Her nephew, Daniel Stiepelman, argues that she sees advantages to all the celebrity appeal.
She's growing used to being in the public eye in a way that most judges usually aren't. When you issue a dissent in a Supreme Court case, what you're doing is you're speaking to future generations, and I think she's smart enough to recognize that being such a powerful force in the media, it makes that voice louder.
There's every sign that her celebrity appeal will continue. A few months ago, this champion of gender and racial equality said she plans to spend at least another 5 years on the Supreme Court, by which time the notorious RBG will be 90 years old.
It was all a dream. Yeah, you know me. Notorious RB to the G. Started at Harvard taking...
That report from Tom Brooke. Indonesia has raised the alert level for the erupting Anak Krakatau volcano to the second highest and ordered all flights to stay clear, days after it triggered a tsunami that killed at least 430 people. A crater collapse on the volcanic island at high tide last Saturday sent waves up to 5 metres high, smashing into the coast on the Sunda Strait between the islands of Java and Sumatra. The BBC's Rebecca Henschke is in the Indonesian capital, Jakarta.
Well, it's spewing out volcanic ash hundreds of metres into the air. Of course, that ash can be deadly for planes if it gets inside the engine. That's why all planes are being rerouted around the volcano to be right out of the way of that volcanic ash. At the same time, these volcanic tremors that have increased, and we're also seeing lava and rocks spewing from the crater, has the authorities concerned that this kind of volcanic activity may trigger another tsunami. So people on either side of the strait in Java and Sumatra are being told to stay well away from the beaches.
And how goes the relief and rescue operation after the first tsunami, Rebecca?
Well, people are staying in evacuation centres along the coast. These places are quite overcrowded. It's been heavy rain in recent days, adding to people's problems. Some of the further away villages, Sunta, for example, aid is only reaching that area now because some of the bridges and roads were destroyed by the tsunami. Helicopters are also going out to the islands off the coast and evacuating people from those areas today. But also people understandably are very frightened. They can still hear the rumblings of the volcano and they're being told that there could be another tsunami. So a very difficult situation for them there.
And therefore people being moved, as you say, back from the coast.
That's right. They're being ordered to stay away from the beach, well away. Very unpredictable situation because that first tsunami hit with no warning. There was no earthquake. The sea didn't withdraw like other times tsunamis have hit this country. So very unpredictable.
That was the BBC's Rebecca Henschke in the Indonesian capital, Jakarta. And that's it from this edition of NewsHour. From me, Julian Marshall, and the rest of the team in London. Goodbye.
NewsHour has been a download from the BBC. To discover more and our terms of use, visit bbc.com/podcasts.